Alright, so we are continuing here to talk about the Platonic dialogue Cratylus. Now, this dialogue thus far has been discussing the origin of words, the meaning of words, etymology. And we've gotten to a point where we are discussing the origin of the word soul. We've discussed examples in previous episodes, but this is a fundamental one. The origin of the word soul. You know, I had a few thoughts earlier before I started recording this, and the never-ending frustration with the modern day and its material approach to explanation, reducing everything to causal relationships, seemingly removing the human mind and anything that means anything to it from that discussion. We can take, for example, our understanding of certain base materials, at least from a utility standpoint. Base materials being, let's say, for example, wood or metal. There are many things that we can make out of wood or metal or other materials. We can explain the physical structure of that wood. We can understand at that level why the wood is the way that it is, why its constitution is in such a way that is necessary for the existence of that object, or the existence of the piece of wood, let's say. And we may say, if we create a chair out of wood, we may say that the material cause of the chair would be wood. And in a culture that is so steeped in the vision of the material causality of things, they would probably remove material because it's implied that that cause is because of the wood. That is, the chair exists because of its wooden structure. But that says nothing of the chair itself, because the chair is something. The chair has a purpose. Many of us, although we may think of the cause of the chair being its wood, many of us do not consider that there are pieces of wood in a room, and then start to think about, what could I do with the pieces of wood that would facilitate my needs? We say, oh, there's a chair there, I need to sit down, so I will sit, because I need to be relieved of whatever. Or this is the chair offers me a position for which I could sit at this table and do my work or eat my food, etc., etc. It has some purpose. It was designed with some purpose. And many of us, I think, see the world through this lens. This is, I think, part of our inheritance from the old world. So is the material causality. But it is a part of a whole that I think we would be much poorer if we did not recognize the meaning behind things. And that's not to deny the material causality, because material causality provides us with profound understanding, and it's very useful. And in the Aristotelian context, we have the material causality of things, we have the formal causality of things, which refers to the formal structure of something, and how that formal structure contributes to its existence and characteristics. We have the efficient causality, which refers to actions or processes that bring about an object or something's existence or change. It's concerned with the agents, or the causes, that set things in motion and produce the desired effect. And then we have final causality, which is sort of what I referred to. This is the ultimate purpose or goal of an object or a thing. It is concerned with the telos, or end, to which the object is directed, and why it behaves in a certain way. So let's cover some ground that we had previously covered, just as an introduction. Socrates says, speaking off the top of my head, I think that those who gave soul its name had something like this in mind. They thought that when the soul is present in the body, it causes it to live and gives it the power to breathe the air and be revitalized, and that when this revitalization fails, the body dies and is finished. It's for this reason, I think, that they called it soul. But hold on a minute, if you don't mind, for I imagine that the followers of Euthyphro would despise this analysis and think it crude. But I think I glimpse one they will find more persuasive. Have a look and see whether it pleases you. So what can we say of this argument about the soul? Socrates is attributing this to those that design the word for soul. In this sense, the soul is the life giver. Regardless of if we agree or not with this interpretation, I think it's an interesting one to follow through. Because we can ask ourselves, is the soul the thing that causes the body to live and gives it the power to breathe the air and be revitalized? And is it the case that when this revitalization fails, the body dies and is finished? So the question is, well, if the soul is equivalent to this explanation, then what do we know about the body and what causes it to live, that gives it the power to breathe in that air? Well, we know that the body is a complex organism. It's made up of many different components, many different cells that have their own jobs to do, as these cells are arranged in such a way that form organs which in turn have their own job to do. We have various levels of processing information from these different places and sending them up higher to some centralized source. The centralized source can then act on it automatically or top-down consciously. Now that's a gross simplification, obviously, but in a sense, the thing that causes the body to live is the air that it breathes, it is the material that it consumes, it is the life that was set in motion within the womb of the mother. And so forth and so on. We can see this the questions that trace back towards the origin as the cells proliferate into the body and the human being that we see in front of us. At a certain point, it was much less sophisticated. And yet we also understand that regardless of its infant state, when I mean infant here, I mean as a matter of a few number of cells within the womb of the mother, within those cells contains everything that's necessary for the development and the growth of the individual. It is a code that is programmed within the cell. Now notice here I'm using a material explanation, but eventually this explanation just cannot be sufficient. For we can say that this genetic code then is expressed differently in different cells. These cells then differentiate. They grow into their own realm of maturity, and within their mature state they are responsible for certain things. Their structure may be different, their function is different, but this all depends on the expression that comes from that code. Now, in the early stages of development, the cells of the embryo divide rapidly and undergo a series of cell fate decisions. It gives rise to various cell types that make up the mature organism. Now we can say that this is controlled by genetic, epigenetic factors, but that really doesn't explain much of anything. We can ask ourselves, well, where does the code come from? We could say that the code of the genes is inherited from the organism's parents, let's say. Genes are made up of DNA. Again, a more fundamental, in terms of the reductionist sense of fundamental. This DNA, it contains the instructions for the future development, function, and reproduction of living organisms. Now they are passed on from one generation to another. And no doubt, just as in Platonic thought, as in Christian thought, as in scientific thought, we have the expression of different spirits at different levels of organization. The things that flow through our experience as human beings that transcend just one individual life. If we ask ourselves, how did DNA come to exist? Well, we can say that perhaps DNA is a structure that is a form of a more basic elements, the nucleotides that form through chemical reactions between simple organic molecules like amino acids, sugars. These molecules are present in the primordial soup of Earth's early oceans. And then we have an interesting word, spontaneous. Nucleotides joining spontaneously to form short strands of RNA, simpler forms of DNA. And then we hide behind terms like evolve. RNA strands evolved. the ability to replicate themselves. And we can go into the process of what evolving means. Through variation, through probability, through mutation. And yet, in all of these cases, we are still left asking new questions, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the pursuit of these questions. There's nothing wrong with the scientific pursuit of these questions. It's an admirable pursuit. But I think we always have to keep in mind and have a humble perspective the degree to which that we do not know. Now, just because we do not know does not mean that we should, in our ignorance, become arrogant and fill the void with something that we are certain of without evidence, without reason. However, by the same token, if we have something by good reason, and perhaps even by evidence, we should not readily deny an explanation that is outside the realm of a concrete scientific exploration into a subject. Now, why exactly I'm wasting my time again talking about this subject, I have no idea. But I think it's important because it comes up often. It comes up often in my mind with the discussion of the soul. It comes up in my mind even if Socrates says that Euthyphro would despise his analysis and think it's crude, even for the ancient Greeks. I say even for the ancient Greeks as though that I'm somehow above them, which certainly is not true. Certainly that must be an example of a lack of humility on the part of the modern man in his opinion towards the ancients. So to return to the point about the soul and the body, they thought that when the soul is present in the body, it causes it to live and gives it the power to breathe the air and be revitalized. So now the soul is something that has a large body to it. Now, when I say body, I don't necessarily mean a physical body. When I say body, I mean more in terms of the conceptual structure of the word. It encompasses a lot of information. In a certain sense, this explanation is false. But if it is going to be equivalent to the thing that gives the body power and life and causes it to live, then there's something about the soul that must be true. Because certainly we would say that the body, that there are causal factors. There is something that causes the body to exist and gives it the power to breathe the air and be revitalized. But without returning to this material reductionism, I think there are multiple things that we can consider. Because there are multiple things that material reductionism does not consider. It holds within its arsenal the quality of emergence. That is, complex phenomena, things such as mind, emerge from simpler fundamental characteristics. Fine, but it speaks nothing of the nature of mind. The nature of mind, no doubt, must be a part of soul. And so the question is, exactly how much of the soul is this balance between this material reductionist way of thinking? The things that cause the body to be and to live, like the pumping of the heart, the flowing of the signals through the nerves, the absorption of oxygen into the bloodstream after a breath of air, the contraction of the muscles, the utilization of carbohydrates and sugars for energy so that we can actually breathe, take in the oxygen, accept the oxygen, to then perform more metabolic activities like digestion, like thought. And how much of it must be wound up within the purpose and the meaning of the thing itself. Now, I mentioned earlier about the material explanation saying nothing of mind. In this example that Socrates gives here, it's not necessary to have a theory of mind. One can get by purely with material explanations of this soul. It's about life and death of the body. It is about causing it to be, power to breathe, and so on. And I think this is part of the reason why it makes it a crude example. And this is also part of the reason why Socrates says, "But I think I glimpse one they will find more persuasive. Have a look and see whether it pleases you. Tell it to me and I will," Hermogenes says. When you consider the nature of every body, what, besides the soul, do you think sustains and supports it, so that it lives and moves about? Hermogenes says there isn't anything. What about when you consider the nature of everything else? Don't you agree with Anaxagoras that it is ordered and sustained by mind or soul? And Hermogenes says I do. Now this is an interesting addition here. Because Socrates says within the nature are the fundamental characteristic traits that make up that thing. When you consider the nature of every body, that is, body as in this physical structure, what, besides soul, do you think sustains and support it? Now Hermogenes says nothing. Now Anaxagoras Let me back up and reread what Socrates says here. What about when you consider the nature of everything else? Do you not agree that it is ordered and sustained by mind or soul? The nature of everything else, and this being sustained by mind or soul. Now it depends what everything else means. Now Socrates may be referring to everything else outside of the body, which would be an interesting conception. Everything outside of the material causal relationship. Everything outside of that is sustained by mind and by soul. Now Hermogenes says, I agree. So Socrates says, keeping in mind that we are talking about the origin of words, so a fine name to give this power, which supports and sustains the whole of nature, would be nature sustainer. This may also be pronounced more elegantly, psyche. Now, with the addition of this comment here, so a fine name to give this power, which supports and sustains the whole of nature, would be nature sustainer. Now the whole of nature, the whole of fundamental characteristic traits, would include the material. But then that begs the question, how is it that the whole of nature is ordered and sustained by mind or soul? What about those organisms, those animals that are inferior to human beings, that do not have the mind that human beings do, to perceive and to view into this reality in the way that we do? If everything in nature is to be sustained by mind or soul, then certainly they are too sustained by this mind or soul. And if they are sustained by mind or soul, that must mean, again, considering nature to be the fundamental characteristic traits of its being, and if we use the material sense, we can use the elements. We can go as far down as we want to the most fundamental. And we could say, okay, here. We can point at that. We could point at it at the various levels of its organization and say that this is a new level of its being. But all the way up the chain and all the way down the chain, there is being. And I think that this nature sustainer, that this always and forever, this permanent existence of being, if I can put it in these terms, must be mind or soul directed. In other words, directed for a purpose. There's something in mind. And so we will have to determine here as we continue to read if what we have been discussing here holds up to and how it compares to the discussion that Socrates is having with Hermogenes. Hermogenes says, absolutely. And I also think that this is a more scientific explanation than the other. Socrates says, yes, it is. Nevertheless, it sounds funny when it's named in the true way with its actual name. Hermogenes says, what are we going to say about the next one? Socrates says, are you referring to the name body? Hermogenes says, yes. There's a lot to say, it seems to me, and if one distorted the name a little, there would be even more. Thus, some people say that the body, or soma, is the tomb, sema, of the soul, on the grounds that it is entombed in its present life, while others say that it is correctly called a sign, or sema, because the soul signifies whatever it wants to signify by means of the body. I think that it is most likely the followers of Orpheus who gave the body its name, with the idea that the soul is being punished for something, and that the body is an enclosure or prison in which the soul is securely kept. As the name soma itself suggests, until the penalty is paid, for on this view, not even a single letter of the word needs to be changed. So we continue here, adding on the layers. And so I think we have these two fundamental explanations here, because we just experienced, unless I'm misinterpreting, a fairly broad understanding of what the soul is. And when I say broad, I don't necessarily mean incoherent or insufficient. When I say broad, perhaps I should say, or perhaps I should mean, that the explanation that was given initially for the soul exists at a different level than the one now in which we are talking about. The body seems to be, in terms of value, lower on the scale. Now we are talking about the body as a place that is the tomb that holds the soul. Now, a tomb, we must remember, is a way to honor and remember the dead. Funny thought that this life that we experience, and in this sort of frame of mind, considering the body to be a tomb, it's as though we are currently dead, awaiting life. A strange way to perceive it, I suppose, but we have more consideration to move and roll forward before we start to say silly things like that. Or I should say that if we do come to such conclusions, they will no longer be silly because of good reason and sound argumentation. But we have yet to get there. So to return to this tomb in which the soul is laid to rest, or perhaps laid in its confinement, in its prison, it would seem to me that the soul is then a much more liberated type of thing. If the body is its tomb, we would have to think, again returning to the previous thought about the level of discussion, before I talked about something that is broad, a consideration of the soul, the definition of the soul being this nature sustainer. And now we have the definition of the body as something that is somewhat separate. For if we are truly imprisoned physically, we ourselves are not the prison. We exist within the prison. And it's as if that individual within the cell, within that structure, contains the real. I don't think that the real is right, but it contains an important element. Otherwise there would be no jail cell. There would be no structure to surround that thing that is. Now, I think the context of mind confuses us a little bit, because where exactly does the soul begin and the soul stop in this physical reality that we find ourselves in? Is it the case that only human beings have the soul and that other living organisms do not? Or is it the case that they do, but it's not as elevated as the human being? How is the soul integrated into reality, is my question. And why is it that they now consider the body to be the tomb of the soul until the penalty is paid for? Hermogenes says, I think we've adequately examined these names, Socrates, but could we investigate the names of the other gods along the lines of your earlier discussion of Zeus to see what kind of correctness they have been given? Now, a rather unfortunate end to that discussion about the names of body and soul, given that they are so fundamental, that they invoke so many rich feelings. But again, we have to remember that this conversation is not necessarily about the nature of the soul. It's about the nature and the origin of the word soul and body. And so we see here that Socrates is just giving the explanation of those that had come up with the names of the words, and why he thinks that a particular group of people had come up with these names in the first place. It is not his explicit exploration into the actual meaning. But again, actual meaning is sort of what they're after. But they're after it in a different way. They're after it in terms of the meaning behind the words of the language that they use themselves. The discussion in terms of perhaps changing the center of the word, again, changing the center we've discussed before in a prior dialogue, but the center being the thing that binds people to a common understanding. If a word is to be changed, it takes, I would imagine, a lot of effort. The meaning behind the word has to change. The narrative behind the word has to change. And so just as we discuss the meaning of the body being this tomb of the soul, that's a bit of a narrative, the sort of prison place for it. If we are to change the meaning of the body, that also must be changed, which would warrant in and of itself a different discussion. But this is not the type of discussion that they're having here. And so this we must remember. Socrates says, by Zeus, we certainly can, Hermogenes. The first and finest line of investigation, which, as intelligent people, we must acknowledge in this, that we admit that we know nothing about the gods themselves, or about the names they call themselves, although it is clear that they call themselves by true ones. Now that statement is interesting, because it is the acknowledgement of the existence of a true name independent of the human mind. That there is some objective standard. And this objective standard, again, is not requisite, does not require the human mind. The second best line on the correctness of names is to say, as is customary in our prayers, that we hope that the gods are pleased by the names we give them, since we know no others. I think this is an excellent custom. So, if it's all right with you, let's begin our investigation by first announcing to the gods that we will not be investigating them, since we do not regard ourselves worthy to conduct such an investigation. But rather human beings and the beliefs they had in giving the gods their names. After all, there's no offense in doing that. Again, interesting. It's interesting because this idea of the level's return is the shortness of sight. That is to know that something exists beyond the view, the field of view. But this field of view is applied to the view and the intellect of the human mind. We say that, at least at the moment that we're having this discussion, there's no possible way for me to know about the true names of the gods. There's no way to communicate with them directly in that sense, because this barrier between the levels, they exist on a different plane of reality. And it's because of this separation that makes discerning the true nature of the name difficult. Hermogenes says, "What you say seems to be reasonable to me, Socrates, so let's proceed as you suggest. Shall we begin, as is customary, with Hestia? All right. What do you think the person who gave Hestia her name had in mind by naming her that?" Hermogenes says, "That's no easy question to answer, in my opinion." Socrates, "At any rate, Hermogenes, the first name-givers weren't ordinary people, but lofty thinkers and subtle reasoners." Hermogenes says, "What of it?" "Well, it's obvious to me that it was people of this sort who gave things names, for even if one investigates names foreign to Attic Greek, it is equally easy to discover what they mean. In the case of what we in Attic call ousia, or being, for example, some call it essia, and others osia, First, then, it is reasonable, according to the second of these names, to call the being or essence, ousia, of things, hestia. Besides, we ourselves say that what partakes of being is estin. So being is also correctly called hestia. For this reason, we even seem to have called being essia in ancient times. And if one has sacrifices in mind, one will realize that the name-givers themselves understood matters in this way, for anyone who called the being or essence of all things essia would naturally sacrifice to Hestia before all other gods. On the other hand, those who use the name Osea seem to agree pretty much with Heraclitus' doctrine that the things that are all flowing, and that nothing stands fast. For the cause and originator of them is then the pusher, or Othon, and so is well named Osea. But that's enough for us to say about this, since we know nothing. After Hestia, it is right to investigate Rhea and Cronus, though we've already discussed the latter's name. Now maybe what I'm about to tell you is nonsense. Okay, so there's a lot there. So what can we make of it? So we must keep in mind that Socrates is attempting to prove or give support to his argument that those who gave names to things, the originator of the names, were wise people. And he says it's obvious to him that that is the case. And he gives the example that if a person is to investigate names that are foreign to Attic Greek, now we must remember that Attic Greek is the dialect of ancient Greek that was spoken in Athens, the city where Plato lived and worked. Now he, being Plato, wrote all of his philosophical works in Attic Greek, and this was considered to be the sort of the literary standard, standard language of the time. Now, if something is to be foreign to the standard language, it is something that comes from outside. He says, even outside of our own language, it is equally easy to discover what they mean. In the case of what we call an Attic ousia, or being, and this is an important word, being. For example, some call it essia. So there's a difference between the two words, obviously, where some call being by a certain pronunciation, and then there are foreigners that call the same concept, that of being, essia, and others by another name, yet again, Osea. He says, first then, it is reasonable, according to the second of these names, to call the being or essence, ousia, of things. According to the second of these names, to call the being or essence of things, Hestia. Now the question is, well, why would it be the case that it would be reasonable, according to the second of those names, which is Essia, to call for to call the being or essence of things Hestia. Now, what I said earlier about different words meaning the same thing, we have to keep this in mind for the following explanation. Now, it would have been helpful, and perhaps Socrates says this at some other point, but I don't quite remember, that the god Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. And the hearth is a brick or stone-lined fireplace. It was used for heating and cooking. In ancient times, the hearth was the central point of the home, and it had an important cultural and religious significance as the place where offerings were made to the gods, where family members gathered for warmth, cooking, and socialization. So it was a binding point. I almost want to equate it to the television, but it's much more symbolic and meaningful than that. It's more like the dinner table, perhaps in the modern day. And so the god of this thing, this cultural binding point that brings together the religion of the culture, it brings together the family for warmth, for fundamental things of belonging, a socialization, cooking. We have this god being the symbol of being or of essence. Now, this god is the sort of uniter of these different terms. For to be the god of the hearth is to be the god of the thing that binds people together. Hestia, as the name, refers to it is a symbol of the central and foundational concept of being in essence. Again, that is wound up of being the being that is above, or that innervates, that flows through this form of connectedness that we experience through the hearth. Again, it's familial, it's religious, it's customary. It is fundamental to being a human being. There's certain natural components that are fundamental characteristic traits of this. Eating, security, again, socialization, the expansion of mind, the illumination of our reality through that process. It's like a process within a process. For we do this socialization at the hearth, which is the thing that binds the socialization process, which itself is a process by which people follow certain rules to bind themselves into a dialogue with one another. Eating, if I hadn't mentioned that, this is the thing that sustains life. Sacrifice. Again, this is more of it's a traditional participation. There's something in mind, there's something that we give up, and there's a reason that we do so that we may gain insights, so that we may receive something. Socrates says, and if one has sacrifices in mind, one will realize that the name givers themselves understood matters in this way. For anyone who called the being or essence of all things Essia would naturally sacrifice to Hestia before all other gods. On the other hand, those who use the name Osea seem to agree pretty much with Heraclitus' doctrine that the things that are all flowing, and that nothing stands fast. For the cause and originator of them is then the pusher, and so is well named Osea. But that's enough to say about this. Okay, so what we see here is two different words to represent being, or what is. We have, I suppose we have three words, don't we? We have ousia, O-U-S-I-A, which is being. Some call it, Socrates says, essia, E-S-S-I-A, and others, O-S-I-A. And so he goes into the description, essia, correlating that to Hestia. Essia being a word used in olden days. And so they would sacrifice to the god that implies the same meaning, applied to the god of being. And those that use the word essia understand that what partakes in being is. Now what's interesting, although there are two different words to represent being here, this essia and the O-S-I-A, Osea, the O-S-I-A has a different belief attributed to it. And that's according to the Heraclitus doctrine, that things that are all flowing, and that nothing stands fast. And so, if we are to say that nothing stands fast, what we are saying is that everything in the world is in a constant state of change or flux. Everything is impermanent, it's subject to change, nothing remains static or fixed. Everything is transient, temporary. And so we can see the difference between the two, because Essia and the associated god Hestia, being the god of the hearth and the hearth itself, it's something very stable. It's the center point of human life, human society, human meaning. And the other form of being is the pusher, the thing that constantly pushes this being, or what is, into a new state. Okay, so again, although we have two words to represent this fundamental concept, there are two different beliefs that lie beneath that structure. Now Hermogenes says, "Why do you say that, Socrates?" "Because I've got a whole swarm of wisdom in my mind." Hermogenes, what sort of wisdom? "It sounds completely absurd, yet it seems to me to have something very plausible about it." "How so?" "I seem to see Heraclitus spouting some ancient bits of wisdom that Homer also tells us. Wisdom as old as the days of Cronus and Rhea." "What are you referring to?" "Heraclitus says somewhere that everything gives way and nothing stands fast, and likening the things that are to the flowing, or R-H-O-E, of a river, he says that you cannot step into the same river twice." Hermogenes says, "So he does." "Well, then, don't you think that whoever gives the names Rhea and Cronus to the ancient ancestors of the gods understood things in the same way as Heraclitus? Or do you think that he gave them both the names of streams merely by chance? Similarly, Homer speaks of ocean, origin of the gods, and their mother, Tethys. I think Hesiod says much Hesiod says much the same. Orpheus, too, says somewhere that fair-flowing ocean was the first to marry, and he wedded his sister, the daughter of his mother. See how they agree with each other, and how they all lean towards the doctrine of Heraclitus. So what do we have here? We have the name-givers. They gave the name Rhea and Cronus to the gods. Now Socrates is making a parallel between their thought and the thought of Heraclitus, because Heraclitus, he has this belief that all things are in a state of flux, that nothing stands fast. And it's similar when we see the names Rhea and Cronus, because they are both the names of streams. And of course the symbolism of the stream, or of water in general, is this substance that is in a constant state of flux. It's it's funny, I think of the expressions that we use downstream, upstream in our everyday language. The water is this idea of the pusher. It is as Homer speaks of, the origin of the gods. Now the origin is the ocean. Now the ocean could be a broader symbol than just that of a stream or of a river of water, as to the lesser degree of. Hesiod saying, fair flowing ocean was the first to marry. And so here we see a particular way of seeing things that then becomes embedded within the language that we use. Hermogenes says, I think there's something in what you say, Socrates, but I don't understand what the name Tethius means, or Tethias means. But it practically tells you itself that it is the slightly disguised name of a spring. After all, what is strained and filtered is like a spring, and the name Tethias is a compound of these two names. Hermogenes says, that's elegant, Socrates. Now, even if we don't understand this on its face, the point is that there is a relationship between the name and this principle we discussed of flowing, this water, impermanence of things. Indeed, it is. But what comes next? We've already talked about Zeus. Yes, we have. So let's discuss his brothers, Poseidon and Pluto. Whether we call him Pluto or by his other name. Hermogenes says, certainly. It seems to me that whoever gave Poseidon his name gave it to him because he saw that the force of the waves stopped him from walking and prevented him from going any farther. Just like a shackle around his feet. Desmos, ton, podon. So he called this god, who is the ruler of the sea's power, Poseidon, because his feet were shackled. Poseidismon. The E was probably added for the sake of euphony. Now, euphony is the quality of being pleasant to the ear. Okay. But perhaps this isn't what it says. Perhaps instead of the S, the name was originally pronounced with a double L. Because many things are known, Pol and Eidos, E-I-D-O-S, to the god. So many things are known to the god. Or maybe he was called the Shaker, Ho Sion, S-E-I-O-N, because he shook, say, Satan, S-E-I-E-I-N, the earth, and the P and D were added on. As for Pluto, he was given that name because it accords with his being the source of wealth, Plutus. Since wealth comes up from below the ground, it seems to me that most people call him by the name Pluto because they are afraid of what they can't see, and they assume that his other name, Hades, associates him with that. And what do you think yourself, Socrates? I think people have lots of mistaken opinions about the power of this god, and are unduly afraid of him. They are afraid because once we are dead, we remain in his realm forever. They are terrified because the soul goes there stripped of the body. But I think that all these things, together with the name and office of the god, point in the same direction. Hermogenes says, how so? I'll tell you how it looks to me, but first answer me this. Of the shackles that bind a living being and keep him in place, which is stronger, force or desire? Hermogenes says, desire is far stronger, Socrates. Socrates says, don't you think then that many people would escape from Hades if he didn't bind those who come to him with the strongest of shackles? Clearly. So, if he is to bind them with the strongest of shackles, rather than holding them by force, he must, it seems, bind them with some sort of desire. Now this question proposed by Socrates, I think it's worth discussing for a moment. Of the shackles that bind a living being and keep him in a place, which is stronger, force or desire? Now we have to remember, Socrates says to keep him in a place, not to move him from one place to another, but to remain in that place. And so we have two words. We have force and we have desire. Of force, we can say, we can imagine, I can imagine myself sitting in this chair. What compels me to stay here? Is it by force? But what exactly does that mean, by force? There's gravity. Gravity is a force. It compels me to be seated in this chair. It glues me to the earth. I'm not floating away. And it's not as though, well, perhaps I should say, of this force, that of gravity, I could, if I wanted to overcome it. I could scoot my chair back, I could lean forward, I could use the muscles in my legs and overcome it, and I could walk away, and I could leave this room. So of this force, it is not strong enough to bind me to this chair. What other force might there be Well, there could be restraints within this room that bind me to this room. There could be restraints that are built by others to keep me in here. That's certainly not the case. I refer to the case that of a prisoner who is bound to a particular place. He is forced to be there. He doesn't desire to be there. But then again, in a relative sense, the desire was the thing that led him down that path. Perhaps he did not choose to accept the potentiality of what it meant to commit a crime and then be forced by a level of being that is above his own that would then find him and confine him to a certain place, that of the state confining the individual within its depths, within its chambers. Now, the desire there in that case was sufficient to overcome the force, perhaps of potential, that would have bound him otherwise. Now, this is sticky language, because he could have easily made the decision to agree that the force of the state was too much for him to pursue his desire and subsequently find himself imprisoned. But then this opens up a bunch of other questions. It's like a cave that continues to go on when we thought perhaps that it had narrowed to a certain point. Again, it opens up on the other side. And it does this because it opens up the question, what is man's relationship to the state? What are his desires? Now, we quickly find ourselves getting farther and farther away from the question that Socrates asked. But also we understand that this is an important element of answering that question. So what does it mean? What does it mean, this desire and its relationship to the state? Is it right to consider the potential of the state a force? Is that our initial starting point for that equation? Because certainly that's when the decision was made. For a law to be broken, certainly there is a bond that is broken. We may believe that that bond or that law to be in place unjustly, and so we may break it because our desire overcomes that force. But again, is it true then that the force of the law holds us in place? I wouldn't say so, because we can choose, we can desire to break that bond. We could break the potential, and we can do as we please, as we see fit. It may be just, it may not be just. We may find ourselves in prison. We may find ourselves on the floor of a state legislature giving our own account, opinion, argumentation for why a particular law is unjust. And so it must be that our desire in this case, now I'm using desire very loosely, is stronger than that force. The very thing that made the laws in the first place was our desire to bind. Now we may create a weak binding force, but it is a force nonetheless. And although forces are not necessarily, how should we say, directed, they have their own laws that they follow, but the mind of man may direct his own forces, let's say, as he sees fit. He may create forces. He may manipulate the forces of the natural world. But when Hermogenes says that the desire is far stronger, I would probably agree with him. Socrates says, don't you think that many people would escape from Hades if he didn't bind those who come to him with the strongest shackles? Hermogenes says clearly, so, if he is to bind them with the strongest of shackles, rather than holding them by force, he must, it seems, bind them with some sort of desire. Now that's an interesting switch, because you would think that to bind somebody by shackles, that would be by force. So how could it be the case then that the shackles that are put on a person after their death, so their soul is stuck in this place, how are they not compelled to be there by force? Because if they had their own say in it, if they were to follow their desires, they would leave that place. So, if he is to bind them with the strongest of shackles, rather than holding them by force, the distinction between that binding and the holding by force. So we could be bound by desire, or we could be bound by force. Now perhaps in my earlier argument I conflated the two. The line seems to me to be a bit blurry at some points. It's rather easy to cross that boundary. So I must be careful, I think, moving forward. But in any case, sticking with the point here that Socrates is making. Again, so if he is to bind them with the strongest of shackles, rather than to hold, you'll have to forgive me, but we have to return to this question. Because the thought occurred to me that when we use the term binding, it often implies that there is the use of some external force or restraint to hold something in place, to prevent it from moving. We can also consider it to mean that something is tying something up, it's fastening it securely, like with a rope or other materials. And on the other hand, we have holding, which has to do with someone's grasp. It's more personal. Again, it is possible for it to be referred to as one's possession without the necessity of an external force or restraint. But what Socrates uses, when Socrates uses this language, he flips them. And he says that the The binding is of the desire, and the holding is of the physical nature of the force. So we have to follow, again, this issue of the meaning of words can get rather tricky. Because we can use the same word and have different meanings. We can also use different words that have the same meaning. But the point of it all is if we wish to understand another, we have to have a shared grammar. We have to have a shared understanding of the words mean. So let's continue to follow Socrates, as we have yet to understand where he is actually going with this. So again, if he, this is Pluto or Hades, is to bind them with the strongest of shackles, rather than holding them by force, he must, it seems, bind them with some sort of desire. Hermogenes says it clearly, or evidently. Now there are lots of desires, aren't there? Yes. So if he is really going to hold them with the greatest shackles, he has to bind them with the greatest desire. Yes. Is any desire greater than the desire to associate with someone whose company one believes will make them a better man? No, there certainly isn't, Socrates. So let's say that this is for these reasons, Hermogenes, that hitherto no one has wished to come back here from there. The words Hades knows how to speak are so beautiful, it seems, that everyone, even the sirens, has been overcome by his enchantments. On this account, therefore, this god is a perfect sophist, and a great benefactor of those who are with him. So great is his wealth that surrounds him there below, indeed, that he even sends many good things to us from it. This is how he got the name Pluto. Again, that is of something of value. On the other hand, because he is unwilling to associate with human beings while they have their bodies, but converses with them only when their souls are purified of all the desires and evils of the body, doesn't he seem to you to be a philosopher? For hasn't he well understood that when people are free of their bodies, he can bind them with the desire for virtue, but that while they feel the agitation and madness of the body, not even the famous shackles of his father Cronus could keep them with him? Hermogenes says, probably so, Socrates. Okay. So what can we say of this little paragraph here? This excerpt from Socrates. So we have an image that's being painted. We have the human being, we have the soul of the human being. That when it is separated from the body, and thereby the desires of that body, when it finds itself in a new place, and if it is indeed to be bound to that new place, it is because it is bound by that desire. And since they are liberated from the desires of the body, they are then hungry for a new form of nourishment, something to feed the soul, let's say. And Socrates says that the sophist, the god Pluto, who perhaps deceives people, perhaps not, but nonetheless binds them by a set of desires that Socrates calls perhaps virtue, or the desire for virtue. And it's impossible when the human beings are embodied, that it is impossible to free them or to liberate them from the desires of that body. It's much more likely then, Hermogenes, that Hades derives his name from what cannot be seen, or Aides, Aides, but from the fact that he knows everything fine and beautiful, and that is why the rule setter called him Hades. So it's not necessarily that what can be seen, but rather it is what can be known. Now what's interesting and maybe I should say that he knows everything that is fine and beautiful. Now what's interesting in our language is that we can use the word see interchangeably for the word knowing. Can you see the point? Do you see where I'm going? Can you see what I mean? It's essentially saying, do you know what I mean? And so this seeing is then separated from its extra-physical connotation of physical sight. Physical sight being relating to that of some organ that has such a structure to it that allows it to take in information. It allows to perceive objects as light bounces off of them. It is able to take this information, send it to the higher centers in the brain for perception. And seeing, and then in that case, is to discover and to determine and to visualize the material objects within our surroundings. Isn't it interesting, just as in our conversation about binding and of holding, that here too we have the potentiality for multiple meanings? And how easily it could be the case that we confuse the meaning of things. Or, I would say worse, reject all possible avenues for understanding that don't have to do with one particular explanation of a word. Okay, so back to the point. Hades is named because he knows everything fine and beautiful. Hermogenes says, all right, but what about Demeter, Hera, Apollo, Athena, Hephaestus, and all other gods? What are we to say about them? Demeter seems to have been so called because she gives nourishment just like a mother. So giving, in parentheses, we have Didousa, Didosa. And nourishment like a mother, we have meter, Meter. Hera is a lovable one, or Erate, and indeed, Zeus is said to have married her for love. But perhaps the rule setter, being a lofty thinker, called her Hera, as a disguised name for air, AER. Now that is in parentheses, I should say. So again, I'll read that. Perhaps the rule-setter, being a lofty thinker, call her Hera as a disguised name for air, that is more the gaseous air that we think of. And then in parentheses there, it's AER. Putting the end of her name at the beginning, you'll get the idea if you repeat the name Hera over and over. Hera, 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 Hera. As for Farafata, it seems that many people dread the names Farafata and Apollo because they are ignorant about the correctness of names, for they changed the first name to Persephone, and then it seems to terrify them, and it seems terrifying to them. Now the footnote here says, presumably because they see it as a meaning, quote, who brings carnage, end quote. But really the name Farafata indicates that the goddess is wise, for since things are being swept along, wisdom is the power to grasp, comprehend, and follow them. Thus it would be correct to call this goddess Farapatha, or something like that, because of her wisdom, that is to say, her power to comprehend what is being swept along. This is also the reason that Hades, since he himself is wise, associates with her. But people nowadays attach more importance to euphony than to truth, so they distort her name and call her Farafata. And as I said, the same thing has happened to Apollo. Many people are afraid of his name because they think it indicates something terrifying. Haven't you noticed this? Now the footnote says they connect Apollo with Apollyon, which is who destroys. So what can we say of this here? It seems like, there's a change between two conditions. The intended initial purpose, which in this case has some more, I guess it could be seen as a more fundamental naming. Fundamental in the sense that it is more oriented to the wise, less oriented to the more destructive type forces who destroys, one who brings carnage. Instead we have names that imply wisdom being the power to grasp, the wisdom of this of the gods, perhaps the one that Socrates mentioned, their power to comprehend what is being swept along. This is like within her ability to be wise. That's why she's associated with Hades, or Hades associates himself with her, since he is also wise. And Socrates, almost in a lamenting fashion, then goes into, people nowadays, this is sort of, it doesn't go away even in Greek society. It's, the change between generations is certainly a real thing. And part of that change rests within the very language that people use. And I think if we have such a significant change from something that is like a grasper of wisdom to something that is more a bringer of carnage, that shift in understanding, in my mind, could be quite dangerous. Because now your gods of concern, your big primary narrative, the cultural drivers, are now one that is based on fear of destruction, rather than that of the pursuit of wisdom. And he says people nowadays are attached more to euphony, that is, sort of the pleasing sound of the name rather than to truth. But the meaning of the name is important. It means something. And at the very minimum, if people are to change the meaning of the name for purposes of pure euphony and don't consider the meaning of the name, then there's no meaning, which I would imagine is probably worse than to change the meaning of a name and then to fear a prominent god, sort of instead of aspire to be like or to follow in the footsteps of that god, to worship that god for their wisdom rather than to worship them for fear of them being destroyed by that god. And in the case of this absence of meaning, there's nothing. It's void. It's nothingness. It's depression. It's hopelessness. It's aimlessness. Both are negative conditions, this change in language and the suffering that comes from the destruction. I mean, it's interesting I use the word there, but destruction of meaning. If the meaning of a word is truly destroyed, then that God then becomes the God of destruction. It's a strange influence. But what is that influence? What causes that change to take place, if it is not that sort of spiritual force, that God of destruction? So perhaps it is a God of destruction that changes the name. I'm not sure exactly how to conceive of this at this present moment, but nonetheless, we are following a tangible point here. And we are staying consistent with our examination of the etymology of words, their origins. Seemingly now we are getting into the effect of their change. Hermogenes says, "I certainly have, and what you are saying is true." Socrates, "In my view, however, the name is most beautifully suited to the power of the god." Hermogenes says, "How so?" "I'll try to say how it seems to me, at least. I think no single name could be more in keeping with the 4 powers of the god. It comprehends each of them, expressing his power in music, prophecy, medicine, and archery." Hermogenes, it's a pretty remarkable name you're talking about. Hermogenes is speaking. "It's a pretty remarkable name you're talking about. So go ahead and explain it." "It's certainly a harmonious one. After all, it's the name of the god of music, to begin with. The purgations and purifications that doctors and prophets use, the fumigations with medicinal and magical drugs, and the various washings and sprinklings that are involved in these processes, all have had the same effect, don't they? Namely, to make a person pure in body and soul." Hermogenes says, "Certainly. But isn't Apollo the purifying god who washes away such evil impurities and releases us from them?" "Certainly. Since he washes and releases and is a doctor for our evil impurities, he might correctly be called Apollo-ion, the washer. On the other hand, it may well be most correct to call him by the name the Thessalians use, since it accords with his prophecy, that is to say, with his single-mindedness, or haplaun, or truthfulness, these being the same thing. For all the Thessalians call this god haplaun, and since he always makes his shots because of his skill in archery, he is also eibelon, or always shooting. To understand how this name accords with his musical powers, we have to understand that the letter A often signifies togetherness. Tuhamu, or Tuhamau, as it does in aklauthos, follower or attendant, and acoitus, or bedfellow, spouse, husband. In this case, it signifies moving together. We call the poles poloi, or the harmonious moving together in music, which we call being in concert, or symphonia. For, as those who are clever in astronomy and music say, all these things move together simultaneously by a kind of harmony. Apollo is the god who directs the harmony and makes all things move together, whether the gods or human beings. So, just as the names Akolothos and Acoitus are derived from Homokolothos or Homocoitus, by replacing homo with a, we call him Apollo, though he was really Homopollon, the one who makes things move together. We inserted the second L, lest his name become an oppressive one. Even as it is, indeed, some people who haven't correctly investigated the force or power of this name are afraid of it, because they suspect that it does signify some kind of destructiveness. But as we said earlier, it really comprehends each of the powers of the god, who is a single-minded, always shooting washer, who makes things move together. As for the muses and music and poetry in general, they seem to have derived their name from their eager desire, or mosthai, to investigate and do philosophy. Leto is so called because of being very gentle and willing to do whatever is asked of her. Or perhaps her name derives from the one used by those who speak dialects other than Attic, many of whom call her Letho, apparently on account of the fact that her character isn't rough but gentle and smooth. Artemis appears to have been so called because of her soundness and orderliness, and because of her desire for virginity. Or perhaps the one who gave her that name was calling her an investigator of virtue, or a hater of sexual intercourse between men and women. It is for some one of these reasons, or for all of them, that the one who gave this name to the goddess gave it to her. Hermogenes says, what about Dionysus and Aphrodite? You're asking great things of me, son of Hipponicus, because there is not only a serious way of explaining the names of these divinities, but a playful one as well. You'll have to ask others for the serious one. But there's nothing to prevent us from going through the playful one. Even the gods love play. Dionysus, the giver of wine, might playfully be called Didoinosus, while wine would most justly be called Oionos, since it makes most drinkers think they understood when they don't. As far as Aphrodite is concerned, there is no point in contradicting Hesiod. We should agree with him that she is called Aphrodite because she was born from foam, or Aphros. Being an Athenian, Socrates, you surely aren't going to forget Athena, or Hephaestus, or Ares either, for that matter. Not likely. No, indeed. It isn't hard to explain how Athena got her name. Which one? Socrates says, Pallas. You know we call her that. Hermogenes says, of course. In my view, we would be correct to think that this name derives from her dancing in arms and armor, for lifting oneself or anything else up, whether from the ground or in one's hands, is called shaking, and dancing, or being shaken, and being danced. Hermogenes says, certainly. She's called Pallas because of this, and correctly so. But how do you explain her other names? Or other name, I should say. You mean Athena? Hermogenes says, yes. That's a much weightier issue, my friend. The ancients seem to have had the same opinion about Athena as do contemporary experts on Homer. Many of them say, in their interpretations of the poet, that he represents Athena as understanding or thought. The maker of names seems to think that the same sort of thing about the goddesses. Indeed, he speaks of her in still grander terms, saying she is the very mind of God, or theonoesis, as if she is Theona, using A in the non-hetic style in place of E, and deleting I and S. But perhaps this isn't the explanation. Perhaps what he called her was Theono, yeah, because of her unparalleled knowledge of divine things. Nor would we be far off the mark if we suppose that what he called her was Ithono because he wanted to identify the goddess with her understanding character. Then he himself, or others after him, made the name more beautiful, as they thought, and called her Athena. What about Hephaestus? How do you explain him? Are you asking about the noble judge of light? Hermogenes says it seems so. It isn't clear to everyone, then, that he is Phaestus, with an E added on. It probably is, unless you happen to have yet another opinion on the matter, and you probably do. Then to prevent me from giving it, ask me about Ares. Hermogenes says, consider yourself asked. All right. If that's what you want. It is proper for a god who is in every way warlike to be called Ares, for Ares accords with virility and courage, or Aaron and Andrea, or with a hard and unbending nature, the one that is called Aratos. Hermogenes says it certainly is. And for God's sake, let's leave the subject of the gods, because it frightens me to talk about them. But ask me about anything else you like until we see what the horses of Euthyphro can do. So there's a lot of language here, a lot of different names, a lot of different syllables, letters added, letters taken out, phrases that these names come from. I think in general we can see a progression of, or an evolution of language here. We can see the observation, the analysis of the current forms of the names that are given, that are available in the popular culture at the time in Athens. And Socrates is able to deduce from the current state of these names perhaps where they came from. But it's interesting that the names themselves and the underlying sort of grammatical architecture that lies beneath is such an expressive style, that has such an expressive style to it. But certainly, if one is to name something, then it should mean something. It doesn't necessarily mean that every name that is given will mean something, like we've discussed. But as we've seen here, of the gods, there are many lofty meanings, many lofty concepts that are stored within the letters, within the particular arrangements. Hermogenes says, I'll do that, but there's still one god I want to ask you about, and that's Hermes, since Cratylus says that I am no Hermogenes, son of Hermes. So let's examine that name, Hermes, and its meaning, to see whether there's anything in what he says. Socrates says, well, the name Hermes seems to have something to do with speech. He is an interpreter. Hermenius, a messenger, a thief and a deceiver in words, a wheeler-dealer. And all these activities involve the power of speech. Now, as we mentioned before, Irene means to use words, and other parts of the name says, as Homer often does, emisato, or he contrived, which means to devise. And it was out of these two words that the rule setter established the name of the god who devised speech, lagain, and words, since Irene means the same as lagain, to speak. It's just as if he had told us, humans, it would be right for you to call the god who has contrived speech Hermes. But we, beautifying the name, as we suppose, call him Hermes nowadays. Hermogenes says, I'm certain that Cratylus was right when he said that I'm no Hermogenes then, since I'm no good at devising speeches. Socrates, but it is reasonable for Pan to be Hermes, double-natured son. How so? You know, speech signifies all things to Pan, and keeps them circulating and always going about, and that it has two forms, true and false. Hermogenes says, certainly. Well, the true part is smooth and divine and dwells among the gods above, while the false part dwells below among the human masses, and is rough and goatish. For it is here, in the tragic life, that one finds the vast majority of myths and falsehoods. Hermogenes says, certainly. Therefore, the one who expresses all things and keeps them always in circulation is correctly called Pan the goatherd, the double-natured son of Hermes. He is smooth in his upper parts, and rough and goatish in the ones below. He is either speech itself or the brother of speech, since he is the son of Hermes. And it's not a bit surprising that a brother resembles his brother, but as I said, let's leave the gods. Hermogenes says, that sort of gods, Socrates, if that's what you want. But what keeps you from discussing these gods? The sun and moon and stars, earth, aether, air, fire, water, and the seasons in the year. Socrates says, that's a lot you're asking of me, all the same. If it will please you, I am willing. Of course, it will. Which one do you want me to take up first? Or since you mentioned the sun, Helios, first, shall we begin with it? Hermogenes says, certainly. If we use the Doric form of the name, I think matters will become clearer. For the Dorians call the sun Helios, so Helios might accord with the fact that the sun collects people together when it rises, or with the fact that it is always rolling in its course around the earth, or with the fact that it seems to color the products of the earth. For poiki el ain means the same as el lane, to shift rapidly to and fro. So we are quickly getting lost in the thickness of the explanation of these words. It's becoming a dense forest the farther we go into it, a cave that again begins to narrow farther and farther. It seems as though we're talking about many substantial names. We're talking about the origin of things. But I'm not entirely sure. Well, it seems as though the answer to the question of what is a name, why is somebody named a particular name, is heading towards an answer of sort of a multiplicitous answer. Now, it's multiplicitous in a sense, but it requires these elements for it to be. A name can be named, or an object can be named for its nature. An object can be named. The name can be modified throughout the years to add or take things away based on how people see things, understand the world. I think the main point here is that it seems as though these rule setters had their observations about the world, about certain patterns of human interaction, about the patterns of, potential ways of being, these big lofty patterns that the gods represent. It seems as though these things are vessels that carry meaning. However you want to conceptualize the divine, that seems to be where much of their meaning is kept. And as we have discussed before, as this meaning changes, or the names change, then the meanings change. Then the nature of that word and that God changes, at least in the eyes of the people. What was before the name to represent the idea, or the influence, the power that was before, still exists. But in the conscious mind and the collective mind, it no longer carries the same form. And so, this dialogue, although it may seem to be quite dry in its continual explanation of the meanings behind certain words, it does serve a purpose, because we are going through various examples that will support some sort of claim by Socrates. Hermogenes says, what about the moon? The name certainly seems to put Anaxagoras in an awkward position. Hermogenes says, why is that? It seems to reveal that his recent theory about the moon deriving its light from the sun is in fact quite odd. Hermogenes says, in what way? Socrates says, Celes, bright light, and phos, light, are the same thing. Now, if what Anaxagoras or Anaxagorians say is true, the light of the moon is always both new, neon, and old, henon. For they say that as the sun circles around the moon, it always casts new light on it, but that the light from the previous month also remains there. And so you can see there's some inconsistencies there with that thought versus what we now understand to be the nature of the moon, and it indeed does reflect the light of the sun. But Socrates seems to approach this understanding through the nature of the word as it is named. But many people call the moon Selenia, and since its light is always both new and old, Celes neon kai enon echi ai, the right name to call it is Selen non Ioea, and this is the one that has been compressed into Selenia. Hermogenes says, and the dithyrambic name is too, Socrates. But what have you to say about the month and the stars? Now, a dithyramb is a choral song to the god of Dionysus, noted for its complex and pompous language. The correct name to call a month, Meses, is Mesis, from Meosthai, to grow smaller. And the stars, Astra, seem to get their name given to them from Astrape, or lightning. For lightning is what causes the eyes to turn upward. Hence, it should really be called an astrope. But nowadays the name is beautified, and it is called Estrap. What about fire and water? I'm really puzzled about fire. So either Euthyphro's muse has abandoned me, or this is really very hard. But notice the device I use in all such puzzling cases. What is that? I'll tell you. But first answer me this. Could you say in what way fire comes to be so called? Hermogenes says, I certainly can't. Here's what I suspect. I think that the Greeks, especially those who lived abroad, have adopted many names from foreign tongues. Hermogenes says, what of it? Well, if someone were trying to discover whether these names had been reasonably given, and he treated them as belonging to the Greek language rather than the one they really come from, you know that he would be in a quandary. Hermogenes, he very probably would. Now look at fire, or pur, and see whether it isn't a foreign name, for it certainly isn't easy to connect it with the Greek language. Besides, it's obvious that the Pythagoreans use the same name slightly altered, and the same holds for water, or hudor, and dog, kuon, and lots of others. Consequently, though one might say something about these names, one mustn't push them too far. That, then, is how I get rid of fire and water. But what about air, Hermogenes? Is it called air because it raises things from the earth, or because it is always flowing? Or because wind, pneuma, arises from its flow? For the poets call the winds pneumata, gales, don't they? So perhaps a poet says eteoros, gale flow, in place of pneumatoros, or wind flow, thereby indicating that what he is talking about is air. As for aether, I'd explain it as follows. It is right to call it aether because it is always running and flowing, rheon, about the air. The earth, G, is better signified by the name Gaia, for Gaia is correctly called a mother, as Homer tells us by using Gaiasi, for to be born. Alright. What was to come next? Hermogenes says, seasons, horai. Socrates, and the two names for the year, Anaiotos, and Etos. If you want to know about the probable truth about the name horai, or seasons, you must look to the fact that it is spelled horai, Horai, in Old Attic. The seasons are rightly called horai, or things that distinguish or mark off one thing from another, because they distinguish horizon, the weathers of winter and summer, the winds, and the fruits of the earth. As for Anaiotos and Etos, they are actually one name. We saw earlier that Zeus's name was divided in two. Some call him Zena, some Dia, and the accusative. Well, exactly the same is true for the name of the year. It is the year by itself that brings the plants and animals of the earth to light, each in its proper season, and passes them in review within itself. Hence, some people call it Etos, because it passes things in review, while others call it Anaiotos, because it does this within itself. The whole phrase is passing things in review within itself. But this single phrase results in the year being called these two different names. Thus, the two names Anaiotos and Etos derive from a single phrase. I say, Socrates, you are making great progress. I think I'm driving my apparent wisdom pretty hard at present. Hermogenes says, you certainly are. You'll be even more certain in a second. Hermogenes, now that we have examined that sort of name, I'd like next to see with what correctness the names of the virtues are given. I mean wisdom, or phronesis, comprehension, synesis, justice, dikaiosune, and all of the other fine names of that sort. Socrates says, that's no inconsequential class of names you're stirring up, Hermogenes. But, since I have put on the lion's skin, I mustn't lose heart. So, it seems I must investigate wisdom, comprehension, judgment, knowledge, and all other fine names of which you speak. Of judgment, in parentheses here, we have nome. Of knowledge, we have episteme. Hermogenes, we certainly mustn't stop until we've done so. Socrates, by the dog. I think that's a pretty good inspiration. What popped into my mind just now, most of our wise men nowadays get so dizzy going around and around in their search for the nature of things that are, that the things themselves appear to them to be turning around and moving every which way. Well, I think that the people who gave things their names in very ancient times are exactly like these wise men. They don't blame this on their own internal condition, however, but on the nature of things themselves, which they think are never stable nor steadfast, but flowing and moving, full of every sort of motion and constant coming into being. I say this because the names you mentioned put me in mind of it. How did they do that, Socrates? Perhaps you didn't notice that they are given on the assumption that the things they are named that the things they name are moving, flowing, and coming into being. Hermogenes says, no, I didn't think of that at all. Well, to begin with, the first name we mentioned is undoubtedly like this. Hermogenes, what name is that? Socrates says, wisdom, or phronesis. Wisdom is the understanding of motion and flow. Or it might be interpreted as taking delight in motion, phores onesis. In either case, it has to do with motion. If you want another example, the name judgment, or nome, expresses the fact that to judge is to examine or study whatever is begotten, or gones and nomesis. For studying, nomen, and examining, scopain, are the same. And if you want yet another example, understanding, or noesis, itself is the longing for the new, or neoesis. But to say that the things that are new is to signify that they are always coming into being. And such things are what the soul longs for, as the giver of the name neosis expressed, for the ancient name wasn't noesis, but noesis. The difference there is the line above the E. But an E took the place of the double E, moderation. So frusune is the savior, soteria, of the wisdom, phronesis, we just looked at. Knowledge, episteme, indicates that a worthwhile soul follows, hepetai, the movement of things, neither falling behind nor running on ahead. So we have ought to insert an E in the name and spell it episteme. Comprehension, synesis, in turn, seems to be a kind of summing up, sologismos, and whenever one says comprehends, it's exactly as if one has said knows, or epistes thai. For soon nyanai literally goes along with, means the soul journeys together with things. As for wisdom, Sophia, it signifies the grasp of motion, but it is rather obscure and non-Attic. Nonetheless, we must remember that the poets often say of something that begins to advance quickly that it rushed, or esthue, esuth. Indeed, there was a famous Spartan man named Sos, for this is what the Spartans called a rapid advance. Wisdom signifies the grasping of this motion, and the assumption that the things that are moving. The name God, Agathon, is intended to signify everything in nature that is admirable. The things that are moving, but some are moving quickly, others slowly. So what moves quickly is not all there is, but the admirable part of it. Hence this name, Tagathon, the good, is applied to what is admirable. Agaston, about the fast. Thun. This is quite a difficult thing to follow. I can't imagine that anybody besides myself would come back to this. But it is interesting to reflect on all the words that we use, especially the loftier words, things like wisdom, and to think about their origin, and to think to ourselves, can I actually define the word wisdom? And there are two paths there. If I feel that I can accurately define wisdom, is it true that what I believe about its definition matches up with the reality? The reality of which would be the nature of wisdom. And the question, of course, is, well, does humanity truly understand the nature of wisdom? On the other hand, if I say to myself, I'm not sure I understand what wisdom is, then it's a conversation with the self to come to some sort of understanding based on many different factors. Perhaps the way that the word has been used in the past, the way that we've experienced it. But the definition here, wisdom, is the understanding of motion and flow, having to do with motion. What can we say of that? Wisdom is the understanding of motion and flow. Understanding itself is the longing for the new. So if we put it in this way, wisdom is the longing for the new of motion and flow. To say that the things that are new is to signify that they are always coming into being. Not quite sure what that means. So it's this longing for coming into being. It's longing for that motion that allows us to come into being, perhaps. And that the grasp of such a thing is wisdom. So what, if anything, useful can we say here? Socrates is talking about the origin of wisdom in terms of the linguistic linguistics behind the word wisdom, that of justice, comprehension, knowledge. What can we say of these things? So I'm not entirely sure what to make of this in motion business. Surely it'll come to, it'll settle just as maybe a particulate settles within a liquid, so where it is visible. But at this point it's difficult to see. Sort of dissolved in that substance. Dissolved in the substance of what is. But Socrates says that when something is begotten, the examination of that point of begottenness is judgment. You're judging the point at which it began its motion. Now this motion, if one is to know, one is to sort of ride this motion in parallel. To understand the direction, perhaps, the velocity of this motion, the big picture of this motion, that is what we may call wisdom. To comprehend something, the seat of being, or the soul, it moves together with things. It's a natural flow. There's no antagonism here. It's not against the grain, it would seem. Still difficult language, because it's not exact, it's not precise. And there is a reference, I should say, to the thing that moves quickly as being the thing that is good. Now, there are many different interpretations that you can have here. This flow, what could it possibly refer to? It could refer to thought. It could refer to mind. It could refer to existence, the flow of existence. Thought, I think, is a good example. But when we say speed, perhaps it's not the speed of thought. When something moves quickly, in this way, it's probably more of our ability to be with something and to follow it as it moves. Now, I guess the speed of which this thing moves, that the soul follows, that we are in connection with, that we can feel, that we understand more than just abstractly, or perhaps with our reason. There's more of an embodied movement. The whole of us moves with this, so that we may understand it. I think perhaps of an engineer, or of a craftsman who really understands their craft. And it's not so much thought that allows them to move quickly, although they must have thought in order for them to move and to understand and to know. But there are multiple components, it's multi-aspectual, that allows for these craftsmen, these people that know to move quickly. It really is not necessarily the speed of thought or the capacity of the mind to think quickly, although those are elements, and perhaps they're minor elements. I think among the various individuals, the thing that we find to know, the soul, the thing that the soul attaches to understand, perhaps the thing that we do in our life to provide for ourselves, I think this should be the thing, not the only thing, but it is a thing. If we choose to know it, we follow it, and we move quickly with it as we become knowledgeable. Socrates continues and he says, "It's easy to figure out that justice is a name given to the comprehension of the just, but the just itself is hard to understand. It seems that many people agree with one another about it, up to a point, but beyond that they disagree. Those who think that the universe is in motion believe that most of it is of such a kind as to do nothing but give way, but that something penetrates all of it and generates everything that comes into being. This, they say, is the fastest and smallest thing of all. For if it were not the smallest, so that nothing could keep it out, or not the fastest, so that it could treat all other things as though they were standing still, it wouldn't be able to travel through everything. However, since it is governor and penetrator of everything else, it is rightly called just. The K sound is added for the sake of euphony. Now in parentheses after just, the word is dikaion. As I was saying before, many people agree about the just up to this point. As for myself, Hermogenes, because I persisted at it, I learned all about the matter in secret, that this is the just and the cause, since that through which diho, a thing comes to be, is the cause. Indeed, someone told me that it is correct to call this Dia, or Zeus, for that reason. Even when I had heard this, however, I persisted in gently asking, if all this is true, my friend, what actually is the just? Thereupon, they think I am asking too many questions and demanding the impossible. And they tell me that I have already learned enough. Then they try to satisfy me by having each tell me his own view, but they disagree with each other. One says that the just is the sun, since only the sun governs all of the things that are, penetrating and burning them. Well satisfied, I tell this fine answer to one of the others, but he ridicules me, asking if I think nothing just ever happens in human affairs once the sun has set. So I persist and ask him to tell me what he thinks the just is, and he says that it is fire, or to purr. But that isn't easy to understand. Another says that it isn't fire, but the heat itself that is in fire. Another says that all these explanations are ridiculous, and that the just is what Anaxagoras talks about, namely mind. For he says that mind is self-ruling, mixes with nothing else, orders the things that are, and travels through everything. Thereupon, my friend, I am even more perplexed than when I set out to learn what the just is. However, the goal of our investigation was the name just, and it seems to have been given for the reasons we mentioned. So a big takeaway from what we have just read here is that the just is called the just because it is the the smallest piece. It is this piece, the fastest piece, the thing that pierces, the thing that penetrates, that governs. And it's interesting to think about the origin of justice, or to think about what justice is. Of course, we have in our modern day the court system. There's the jury of our peers, there's the judge, there are the lawyers that understand the legal profession, that represent their clients. But where does this justice come from? How is it to be embedded within a government that has separation of church and state? Where is it that we find this justice? Now, we have a system, again, that is based on agreement. It is based on convention. It is based on lessons learned from the past. Why is it the case that murder is bad? Why is it the case that we should not take from our neighbor or harm our neighbor for our own purposes? These sorts of things and many more have come to us from a long line of lessons learned. And it is through our collective judgment that we come to an understanding of what is right and of what is wrong. Of course, if we commit a wrong, and if we wish to retain some sort of social cohesion, social collective, there are, by its very nature, rules, boundaries, by which this system, the society, must operate. For if it did not, there would be nothing to bind it together. But that's not to say that the laws are the only thing that bind a society together. But it's certainly an important component. But it is yet a funny thing to think about how elusive true justice really is. And it's, on one hand, it's unfortunate because we hear Socrates say that he has practiced these matters and he has learned in secret about the nature of justice. And of course, in Socrates' way, he goes about asking other people, exposing their ignorance. And then we get to the unfortunate conclusion that the goal of the investigation was the name just, but not the nature of justice. Now, the nature of justice has been covered in previous dialogues, I suppose, but it would be nice to return to such a lofty subject. In any case, Hermogenes says, "I think you really must have heard this from someone, Socrates, rather than making it up as you went along. What about the other explanations I've mentioned?" Hermogenes says, "I certainly don't think you heard those." Socrates says, "Listen then, and perhaps I'll be able to deceive you into thinking that I haven't heard the remaining ones either. After justice, what's left? I don't think we've discussed courage, but it's clear that injustice is really nothing more than a hindering of that which penetrates. Courage signifies that this virtue was given its name in battle. And if indeed the things that are flowing, then a battle cannot be anything but an opposing flow. If we remove the D from Andrea to get Andrea, or a flowing back, the name itself indicates this fact. Of course, it is clear that courage doesn't oppose every flow, but only the one that is contrary to justice. Otherwise, courage wouldn't be praiseworthy. Similarly, male, or Aaron, and man, Aner, indicate upward flow. It seems to me that Gune, or woman, wants to be gone, G-O-N-E, the slash above the E, or womb, that Thalus, or female, comes to be Thale, or nipple, comes from Thale, nipple, and that a nipple, Thale, is so called Hermogenes because it makes things flourish in just the way that watering makes plants flourish. So what can be said of all of this? It's interesting, the discussion of flow. This flow and this motion, although not really explicitly stated, is caused by and is with something that is generally considered to be good. And of course we have the discussion about the smallest and the fastest. The thing that is the governor and the thing that is the penetrator. That through which a thing comes to be is the cause, as Socrates says. And so we have a bunch of different ideas here that are floating about this congregation of the consciousness. It begins to solidify very slowly, because what we have to keep in mind, what we have to remember, is that this is a person over 2,000 years ago, almost 2,500 years ago, talking about the rule setters for the language that they use in their own day. And so this really has to do with the beginning of mind, the beginning of the linguistic mind. Now that statement may not be exactly correct, because there are many languages. There are many forms of speech. But it's a beginning of a sort, if it is not the beginning of mind, or if it's not the beginning of the linguistic mind, it is the beginning of a certain type of linguistic mind. And what seems clear to me is that this type of linguistic mind is orienting itself in relation to something. The question is, well, what is this thing that it is orienting itself in relation to? And this is where I mentioned that there's nothing explicitly stated. And then I mentioned the fastest, the smallest, the governor. This thing that penetrates the universe, that seems to give it its intelligibility. And we have this constant referencing to motion. That which impedes motion is somehow negative. It's unjust. Courage is only good, it's only really courage, if it opposes the unjust. Even though if it goes to war, if it goes to battle, it stops and pauses motion. This in and of itself is bad. But to oppose the injustice that seeks to permanently, perhaps, or just temporarily for its own purposes, or to divert the motion, or to slow it, this injustice, this war against this injustice is considered courage. And so we see here, even if we don't explicitly understand what this motion is, we understand that it is a powerful force. It is a force that we orient ourselves around. And we do so because we believe that it is good, that it is right, that it is something. I think something to be kept in mind is that this motion, or I should say motion in general, is not considered here by Socrates to be the good itself, let's say. For not all motion is good. You could have motion that is slow or slowed, and this is not the same as the motion that is considered unimpeded or euphoric, and so that it is free to flow. And so I return to the point I made earlier. We have to remember that we are talking about the origin of words. We are talking about the origin of words for a particular purpose. We're trying to discover their meaning, why they have meaning. And again, we discuss this motion. And a lot of this language so far, a lot of the rule setter's language, is centered around this motion. Now of the female, Socrates says that the female is so named because it is after the name of the nipple. The nipple is something that provides nourishment. But ultimately, this name can be seen to mean that which makes things flourish. That is the female. And man is upward flow. And so in my mind, albeit perhaps superficially, perhaps not, it doesn't matter, I consider this upward flow and the thing that makes things flourish, the man and the female respectively. I think they complement each other quite well. And if we are to consider the origin of these words, the thing that makes something else flourish also makes the thing that moves upward flourish. You know, if man did not have the female, that upward flow would be certainly diminished, deteriorated, or if the female condition was reduced in some way, in some fundamental way, where she was not involved in the nourishing of her children, then this would impede the flow of man. Now I can hear the, postmodern alarm bells going off about all the possible implications of what that might mean between the relationship of man and woman. That would seem to suggest that the woman is subservient to the man. Now we know that in the Athenian society, they were a chauvinistic society. But I don't wish to get into a destructivist argument here. I think if we are to remain with our gaze fixed, looking upward, I think we can say that there is a positive relationship here. Both roots of man and of woman here, in terms of the names that they are given, are fundamental. They have fundamental qualities about them. And it may be unfortunate to some, perhaps, that their qualities seem to be fixed within their name. But I don't think it's worthwhile to dwell on such things for too long. It brings us nowhere. Now I may shy away from reading word by word here and to sort of fall back into talking about concepts. Maybe talking about specific words that Socrates mentions here. Because there are some dialogues, this being one of them, that the reading gets dull pretty quickly because the point is spread out over many pages. And so we go through many different examples, many different words, and again, it's possible that we lose sight of the main conversation. So let's keep this motion close to our hearts here as we move forward. Socrates discusses the word techne, or craft, and in a slightly modified version, techne means the possession of understanding. And if we are to sort of combine, in a mathematical way, the equivalence of the possession of understanding, we could say that this is the possession for the longing of the new. And we also have to remember that the act of examining the begotten is called judgment. What is the begotten is the creation or the birth of something that is new. We also have to remember that wisdom is the grasp of motion. We have to remember that that which moves quickly is the good. Wisdom, put in another way, is understanding of motion or flow. It can also be the equivalent of wisdom being the longing for the new motion or flow. And through our longing, we produce judgments at the inception of this new motion or this new flow that we discover. And as we ride this new motion, we are inside of it, we become with it, then we know. And the grasp of this whole process is wisdom. Now we have talked briefly about this motion and this flow that seems rather elusive. The question does remain, what is the flow? What is the motion? And it's interesting at this point in thought, the next sort of part of the dialogue goes into the names of things that are subject to ornamentation, which disfigures its meaning. You have a name, you can add or subtract some letters to make it, as they call it, euphonically, or in the arms of euphony, within the grasp of euphony, the word is changed for purposes of style, or of sound, and it has no regard to the truth, the reality that undergirds the name itself. Now, we have discussed many times the importance of a name and the importance of understanding its meaning, because it is a strong cultural binding force. It binds people together. It allows people to understand one another. Not only one another, but it helps people understand the reality that's around them. It allows them to properly categorize objects within their mind. It's a way of illuminating the landscape, making it intelligible to us. Now we move into a discussion about what Socrates calls the summit of their exploration, which some may guess this is about virtue, the word virtue, and of vice. He makes a bit of a detour. He mentions cowardice here. Now, we've mentioned what courage is. It's this battle against that which attempts to stop the flow or stop motion. And cowardice, if we were to use the same analogy, we would imagine it to be perhaps the thing that fights on the other side, that fights for the binding, that fights for the halting of the motion. Now, literally, Socrates says that the origin of this cowardice is signified by the name Dalia. And it has to signify the soul being bound by the strongest of shackles. And it leads us to a word called aporia, which is perplexity, inability to move on. It's considered a vice. The soul becomes stagnant. It becomes receptive to stagnation and all of the ailments of the vices that we can think of. It hinders movement. And it's interesting to reflect on the relationship between this movement and the susceptibility of a soul to be infected by various vices. It's as if the soul stops. If it stops to smell the roses, it takes a look around. Perhaps then it would find something. It would find something and take it away from that which truly fulfills it, that provides it with the highest meaning, perhaps we could say. And it's filled with desire. It's filled with the want for a quick fix. Perhaps a sugary treat or a pleasure of the body. And Socrates says that it is the hindrance or the restraint of this motion whose possession by a soul. Interesting to think of it in this way, almost as if this restraint, lack of motion, the slow motion, can be grasped by a soul. Now it's interesting to also to reflect on that we understand that this process of longing for the new, following the motion of things, into this knowing, the appropriate judging of the inception of this flow, perhaps the inception of this flow into the human consciousness, What does this flow mean? And perhaps it could mean the discovery of a passion. But this passion isn't all that there is. It is accompanied by something. It is accompanied by something very real, by the understanding of something, perhaps a profession, a responsibility, something that somebody can be absorbed in and find the truth in. Now, it doesn't mean that slower motions, things that are perhaps against the grain in the mind of a person, is void of truth and of knowledge. But if a person is unable to surrender themselves fully into the flow and into the motion, so that they may truly know, then I think this leads them open to vice, because there is room for something to fill that void. They're not completely engrossed in that duty, we could say, that responsibility, the job. Now, there are many interesting, I think, contemporary parallels that we can draw here. And I think there are some interesting things to be said about the nature of our current professions and our culture. We seem to have the right idea and understanding that a profession is extremely important. But there is also something that's devaluing about many of our professions these days. We give up much of our time and resources, not to the flow of the profession, but rather to the bodies that facilitate, in many cases, facilitate the growth of that profession. But again, it can be a parasitic relationship, which can work for a time, I suppose. But it limits us. It limits our flow, just in the way that if we are not completely engrossed or completely embodied in what we are doing, then the remainder will be filled. It will be sought by whatever can find it. The evil, the loose spirits that surround us. And it's after this point that Socrates begins to talk about euphoria, or the ease of movement, being the opposite to the aporia. And that the flow of a good soul is always unimpeded. And so we have the word kakya, that is the name for the soul that becomes restrained and filled with vice. Or perhaps that the soul grasps the restrained or the limited motion and then becomes filled with vice. The opposite to that word is the arete. This arete is the unrestrained and unhindered. It is always flowing. Now the next word here is Eshron. Probably mispronounced that, but whatever. It's Aishron. This is the disgraceful or the ugly. Now what's interesting is that obviously many Platonic dialogues, Plato's philosophy, has to do with the good and the beautiful. And to discuss a thing such as the disgraceful and the ugly should have a fairly profound implication. And I think it does, even though the explanation of this word is fairly limited. I think it says a fair deal. can we make of this disgraceful and this ugly? Again, we're talking about this motion and this flow. We have another important addition here that we can make to our centralized philosophy, the thing that we keep coming back to, the thing that we imagine the name setter, the rule setter, has for his naming of things, the center of this. Socrates says, the rule setter, I'm paraphrasing, is concerned with the flow of the things that are. Now, what is disgraceful and what is ugly is the thing that hinders or restrains the flowing of the things that are. The important thing here is not necessarily the word or the hindering. We could have probably guessed that. But the important thing here is to reflect on what it means for the rule setter to have been thinking about the flowing of the things that are. So what can we say of the things that are? Well, let me take myself, for example. The flowing of the things that are, if we are to say that something is, then it exists. It exists of itself, I guess we can say. Not necessarily for itself, but it has, again, the fundamental characteristics. Its nature. And the nature is what we are after. We have our material nature. We have the nature of mind. We have the fundamental characteristics that surround complex phenomena that are not necessarily specific to the more fundamental pieces. And I don't want to make an argument for strict emergence here, but it is a component. And so the things that are, while I'm coming closer, I still have yet to fully understand. But perhaps to use the word understanding in this context is not correct. But maybe it is. For if I am to understand, then... But perhaps I do understand. I long for the new. I am judging the begotten. I am forming a new understanding through my longing. And through my motion, I am coming to know the nature of things. And I think in this way, as one approaches this wisdom, one can also, I think, relate to the rule setter or the name giver. As this must have been much of the thought process that he had undergone. To long for the understanding of something. And this birth of insight, and this flow of knowing, coming to understand a thing, to be able to categorize it, seemingly from nothing. I don't want to make a big deal about that statement, because it's not intended to make a big deal out of it. But I'm just imagining an individual who found themselves in the darkness, as we all do as we are brought into this reality. As I've mentioned in the Psalms, sort of stumbling around this darkened room, trying to make sense of it. A big step must be categorizing all of it, categorizing fundamental pieces of it. Not wholly, mind you, in terms of its material composition, for its nature is more than just its material composition. Now we could argue if that moreness is just our own subjective experience, even though that the subjective experience is shared by the material nature of the human mind between other human beings. We need not get lost in this spider web. But now we get into this discussion of the fine and the beautiful. This word Kalon, K-A-L-O-N. It's another interesting conversation. Socrates says, in my view, this name derives from a sort of thought, dianoia. So the name for the fine and the beautiful is derived from a form of thought. Interesting. And so he poses the question, what caused each of the things that are to be called by a name? Isn't it whatever gave them their names? Wasn't it thought, whether divine or human or both, that did this? Interesting distinction to make. Divine or human or both. And isn't what originally named them the same as what names them now? That is to say, thought. And so, I can follow Socrates here. Because we have the possibility of a consciousness, of a mind, of thought that is beyond man. And then we have our reality that could just be man, and we can have both. But what he says next, I'm not sure I completely understand. He says, aren't all the works performed by thought and understanding praiseworthy? While those that aren't are blameworthy. And if we consider all of the works performed by thought, certainly it would be possible to find a work of thought that is not praiseworthy. I think it's fairly simple and easy to find that. But if we were to combine that work of thought, or the work performed by thought, with understanding, again, this sort of longing for the new, the thought that is a longing for the new. It is longing for the birth of a new flow of something to follow. And in that longing there must be truthfulness, there must be earnestness. That thought, that belief, if it is true, it is there to truly follow. And in that sense it would be praiseworthy. Whereas those that are not, perhaps the unrestrained thought, the thought of restricted motion, the thought that is not after, that it doesn't have the longing for the new. We could say this, we could see this being blameworthy. So what of it? We have this thought and understanding couple. Socrates says, medicine performs medical works, carpentry performs carpentry. And in this similar vein, so what vein exactly is this? What medicine What about performing medicine? What about the profession of medicine performs medical works? Medicine, as an action, as a profession, to put on its performance, it does so through its thought and understanding relationship. Its thought and longing for the new, or for the birth of I can't use the same word, but the birth of a way of seeing that, given enough time and enough discipline, turns into holding. It turns into a grasp. And this grasp is wisdom. And so again, we return to the medicine performing medical works. Medicine performing by thought and understanding accomplishes these medical works. And the medical works in and of themselves is a type of flow, I would say. Or we could also say that the medicine performing is the type of flow, and the medical work that we achieve, or that we arrive at, is the work, and the grasp of that is that wisdom. Same applies to the carpentry, and then the same also applies to the naming of things, which is kaloun, K-A-L-O-U-N. That is to name things. He says to name things is to perform beautiful works, which is cologne. Again, that word that we discussed. And he says, we then shall say that is thought that does this. He poses it as a question, sort of kind of a rhetorical question to Hermogenes, confirmatory question. And so why, again, exactly is this the case? To name things is to seek a particular fundamental type of understanding. It is the origin of meaning in this linguistic sense. It's this opening of a whole aspect of mind for categorization and intelligibility. And that is a work of art. It is beautiful. Because what flow exactly are we following here? Medicine performs medical works. What does naming perform? It performs beautiful things. Again, the thing that is beautiful is what is produced, the meaning. Socrates says, therefore wisdom, phronesis, is correctly given the name cologne, beautiful, since it performs the works that we say are beautiful and welcome as such. It performs the works. Interesting place to place that, because we have an equivalence here between wisdom and beautiful. But this equivalence isn't necessarily equivalent to what we had before, this grasping of the totality. Now we have somewhat of a reduced form that performs the work. It could be equivalent if we stretch it, perhaps. It performs the work, it grasps the work, as it is being performed. And it is beautiful. So I'm going to stop it here. This concludes this episode of Cratylus. And I will continue next time with this dialogue of Plato, discussing the origin of words.